February 24, 2022. Russian tanks rolled across the Ukrainian border, and within hours, the world responded. But not with soldiers, not with missiles, not with boots on the ground. Instead, Western governments launched a different kind of assault. They froze $800 billion worth of Russian assets, cut major banks from the SWIFT payment system, banned transactions with the Russian central bank, restricted exports of advanced technology, and imposed travel restrictions on thousands of individuals. The ruble crashed 30% in days. Stock markets halted trading. Russians lined up at ATMs, desperate to withdraw cash before their money became worthless. All without a single NATO soldier crossing a border. All without firing a shot. This is the new face of warfare. Invisible, instant, devastating, and it raises a question that should terrify anyone paying attention. If economic weapons can cripple a nuclear power in 72 hours without military intervention, what does that mean for the rest of us? What happens when the global financial system itself becomes a battlefield? And most importantly, who decides who gets cut off from the world economy and who's next? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The same weapons being used against Russia today have been tested for decades on smaller targets. Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba, Syria, countries that learned the hard way what it means when money becomes a weapon, when your currency becomes worthless overnight, when your banks can't process transactions, when medicine stops arriving because no one will risk doing business with you even when it's technically legal. Wars used to require sacrifice, soldiers dying, budgets stretched, citizens feeling the cost. But sanctions feel free. They cost almost nothing to impose. No political backlash, no body bags, no evening news showing flag-draped coffins returning home. Just a signature on an executive order and an entire economy collapses. That's why they've become the weapon of choice. Since 1990, the use of economic sanctions has more than doubled. The United States alone maintains sanctions programs against more than 24 countries and countless individuals. The European Union has followed suit. The United Nations has joined in, and the result is a world where economic warfare has replaced military confrontation as the primary tool of foreign policy. But there's something nobody talks about, something buried in the academic studies and quietly acknowledged by the people who design these programs. Sanctions don't work, at least not the way we're told they do. Research shows that since 1970, unilateral sanctions have achieved their stated foreign policy goals only 13% of the time. 13%, and even that number is contested. Some scholars put the real success rate at 4%. So why do we keep using them? Why have sanctions become more popular, even as evidence mounts that they fail to change government behavior? The answer is simpler than you might think. Sanctions aren't designed to succeed. They're designed to look like action without requiring sacrifice. They're designed to let politicians claim they're doing something without the political cost of actually doing something. And the people who pay the price are never the ones making the decisions. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to the beginning and figure out why economic sanctions seemed like such a brilliant idea in the first place. After World War I, the world was desperate for alternatives to military conflict. The carnage had been too great, the cost too high, the devastation too complete. Surely, thinkers reasoned there had to be a better way. Some method of pressuring nations to change their behavior without resorting to tanks and bombs and trenches filled with bodies. Enter economic sanctions. The idea was elegant. If war is about destroying an enemy's capacity to fight, why not just take away their money instead? Cut off their trade, freeze their assets, deny them access to international markets, force them to choose between maintaining their policies and economic survival. It seemed humane, surgical, precise. The League of Nations embraced this vision, writing economic sanctions into its charter as an alternative to armed confrontation. John Maynard Keynes himself declared he was certain the world greatly underestimated the impact of economic sanctions. They would prevent wars, the thinking went. They would give nations a way to punish bad behavior without invasion, a tool that would spare lives while still applying pressure. History proved Keynes catastrophically wrong. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League imposed sanctions. Italy ignored them and conquered Ethiopia anyway. When Japan invaded Manchuria, sanctions failed to stop the aggression. In fact, Japan's response to sanctions, particularly oil embargoes, was to expand its conquest to secure the resources it needed. The attack on Pearl Harbor was, in part, a direct result of American economic pressure. But the lesson wasn't that sanctions don't work. The lesson, apparently, was that they weren't being used often enough or aggressively enough. After World War II, the idea gained even more traction. The Cold War made direct military confrontation between superpowers to dangerous nuclear weapons had raised the stakes beyond acceptable limits. So economic pressure became the preferred tool. Safer than war, more powerful than diplomacy. Or so the theory went. And there was another incentive that nobody said out loud. Sanctions let politicians avoid the hardest question in foreign policy. Are you willing to send your citizens to die for this cause? With sanctions, that question disappears. There's no draft, no deployment, no casualties. Just economic pressure applied from a safe distance with no American blood at risk. For politicians, it's perfect. You can claim to be tough on foreign adversaries without facing the political cost of actual military action. You can satisfy domestic constituencies demanding action without asking them to pay for it in any tangible way. It's foreign policy without consequences, at least without consequences for the people making the decisions. The cost, of course, falls somewhere else entirely. Here's what we were told sanctions would do: target the leadership, apply pressure to the government, force policy changes without harming ordinary citizens, surgical strikes on the economy that would leave civilians untouched. Humanitarian exemptions would ensure that food and medicine continued to flow. Only the bad actors would suffer. Here's what actually happens, every single time, without exception. Sanctions destroy the middle class. They create hyperinflation that wipes out savings. They collapse currencies, making imports unaffordable. They trigger unemployment as businesses shut down or can't access international markets. They cause shortages of essential goods, even those technically exempted from sanctions. And they strengthen exactly the people they're meant to weaken, while devastating everyone else. Take Iran, for instance. The United States has maintained some form of sanctions on Iran since 1979. In 2012, those sanctions intensified dramatically. The goal was to pressure Iran's government over its nuclear program. Humanitarian goods, medicine, and food were explicitly exempted. This was supposed to be a targeted campaign against the regime, not the Iranian people. The reality was very different. Research shows that Iran's middle class shrank dramatically under sanctions. The segment of society that historically pushed for reform, that advocated for moderation, that served as a bridge between extremes, was systematically destroyed. Average GDP growth dropped by over 3% per year. Inflation soared. The Iranian rial collapsed, losing more than half its value, and the humanitarian exemptions, they failed completely. Even though medicine was technically allowed, pharmaceutical companies refused to sell to Iran because the financial transactions were too risky. Banks wouldn't process payments for fear of running afoul of sanctions. Insurance companies wouldn't cover shipments. The result was that cancer patients couldn't get chemotherapy. Children with rare diseases went without treatment. Diabetics struggled to find insulin. During COVID-19, when Iran became one of the hardest-hit countries, sanctions prevented it from accessing medical supplies and equipment. Hospitals ran short of protective gear. Test kits were unavailable. Ventilators couldn't be purchased. The UN Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures found that sanctions substantially exacerbated the humanitarian situation, causing unnecessary suffering among the most vulnerable populations. But here's the crucial detail. None of this changed Iran's government policy. The nuclear program continued. Regional activities continued. Support for proxy forces continued. The people making the decisions in Tehran were largely insulated from the economic pain. They had access to foreign currency reserves. They controlled parallel economic systems. They found ways around the restrictions. Meanwhile, ordinary Iranians suffered the consequences of policies they had no power to change. This pattern repeats in every sanctioned country. Iraq in the 1990s, Venezuela today, Syria, North Korea, Cuba for over 60 years. The governments adapt. The leadership survives. Often, they grow stronger, using external pressure to rally nationalist sentiment and justify authoritarian crackdowns. Meanwhile, the civilian population bears the full weight of economic collapse. Studies show the most vulnerable always suffer most. the poor, the sick, women and children, people with disabilities, refugees, the people with the least power and the least ability to pressure their governments. The very people sanctions are supposed to protect end up as collateral damage in an economic war they never chose to fight. And the cruelest part, the people imposing sanctions know this. They have access to the same research. They read the same studies. They hear from the same humanitarian organizations documenting the suffering. But they continue anyway because the political incentives point in only one direction. Doing nothing looks weak. Military action is too costly. Sanctions let you claim you're doing something while avoiding the hard choices. So the cycle continues. Governments impose sanctions that fail to change policy but succeed in devastating civilian populations. And because the costs are invisible to voters in the sanctioning countries, there's no political pressure to stop. Now we need to ask the harder question. If sanctions rarely work and always cause humanitarian harm, why do they keep getting more popular? Why have they become the default response to almost any foreign policy challenge? The answer is systemic. Sanctions have become attractive precisely because they don't require the same level of public consent as military action. In a democracy, sending troops to war requires debate, justification, sustained public support. But sanctions can be imposed with an executive order. No congressional vote needed in most cases, no public referendum, no primetime speech explaining why American lives should be risked. This creates a dangerous moral hazard. When you can wage economic war without permission, without oversight, without immediate political consequences, you remove the natural checks that make governments think carefully before acting. The friction that once made war a last resort simply disappears. Look at the pattern. A foreign government does something the United States opposes. Rather than engage in difficult diplomacy or make the case for military intervention, officials impose sanctions. The media reports it as tough action. Domestic political constituencies are satisfied. The target country is isolated. Everyone moves on, except the millions of people whose lives are about to be destroyed. And here's where it gets truly insidious. Sanctions create their own justification for more sanctions. When the first round fails to change behavior, the response is never to question whether sanctions work. It's always to impose more, tougher restrictions, broader targets, secondary sanctions that punish third parties for doing business with the sanctioned country. The logic becomes circular. If sanctions aren't working, it's because they're not comprehensive enough. This is how you get situations like Cuba, sanctioned for over 60 years with zero policy change. Like Venezuela, where sanctions contributed to economic collapse but didn't remove the government they targeted. Like North Korea, more isolated than ever, but still developing nuclear weapons. The sanctions don't achieve their stated goals. But they're never lifted because lifting them would look like weakness or failure. Meanwhile, something else is happening. The people designing sanctions have learned they can use economic pressure as a substitute for difficult decisions. Don't want to intervene militarily in Syria? Sanction Assad can't build domestic support for confronting Russia. Sanction oligarchs concerned about Chinese human rights abuses but don't want to risk trade relations. Sanction specific officials, it's policy theater. It creates the appearance of action without requiring real commitment or sacrifice. The problem compounds because sanctions are politically costless to the imposing country. They don't show up in the defense budget as a line item. They don't require raising taxes. They don't produce footage of suffering that plays on the evening news back home. The damage happens somewhere else to someone else in ways most voters never see or understand. This is the pattern. Distance between decision and consequence. Invisible costs imposed on people who can't vote you out of office. A tool that lets politicians claim strength without demonstrating courage, and most importantly, a weapon that becomes more attractive the more it's used, because it establishes precedent. If we sanction them, why not sanction them too? If we cut off one country, why not cut off another? The barrier to using economic warfare keeps dropping because each use normalizes the next, and because the costs are deferred and externalized, there's never a reckoning that forces a reassessment. Now we arrive at the present, at the most sophisticated version of economic warfare ever devised. Because in the 21st century, money isn't just money anymore, it's data flowing through systems. And those systems are controlled by a very small number of actors. The most powerful weapon in the modern sanctions arsenal isn't trade restrictions, its financial infrastructure, specifically a Belgian cooperative called SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. You've probably never heard of it, but it connects over 11,000 financial institutions in more than 200 countries. It handles 44 million messages a day, and it's become the pressure point through which economic power flows. SWIFT doesn't move money. It sends messages between banks instructing them to move money. But without those messages, international payments become nearly impossible. No wire transfers, no trade finance, no currency exchange. Getting cut off from SWIFT is like having your phone, internet, and postal service shut down simultaneously. You're not technically offline, but good luck communicating with anyone. The United States has weaponized this system with devastating effect. In 2012, when the Senate passed legislation authorizing sanctions on SWIFT itself, if it processed transactions with certain Iranian banks, Europe had no choice but to comply. Even though the transactions were legal under EU law, even though they complied with UN Security Council resolutions, the threat of losing access to US financial markets was enough to force SWIFT to expel the Iranian institutions. Think about that for a moment. A messaging system headquartered in Belgium, operating under European law, was compelled to enforce American foreign policy because the alternative was economic annihilation. This is the power of controlling the financial infrastructure of the global economy. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the West expelled 7 major Russian banks from SWIFT. These banks handled roughly $700 to $800 billion in annual cross-border flows. The ruble collapsed, markets froze. Russians couldn't use credit cards. The economy went into crisis overnight. Not because of bombs or bullets, but because messages stopped flowing through a computer system in Brussels. But here's what nobody wanted to talk about publicly. Using SWIFT as a weapon has consequences. Big ones. Countries around the world watched what happened to Russia and drew a very obvious conclusion. If you cross the United States or its allies, you can be cut off from the global financial system instantly. Your reserves can be frozen. Your transactions can be blocked. Your economy can be strangled. All without a vote, without a trial, without recourse. So they started building alternatives. Russia developed SPFS, its own payment messaging system. China built SIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system. India and other countries started settling trade in local currencies, bypassing dollars entirely. The BRICS nations expanded to include more members and began working on BRICS-Pay, a SWIFT competitor. Central banks around the world began accumulating gold instead of dollar reserves. This is de-dollarization, the slow but accelerating process of reducing dependence on the US dollar and American-controlled financial infrastructure. It's happening because sanctions taught the world a lesson. The dollar isn't just a currency, it's a weapon. And if it can be turned against Russia today, it can be turned against anyone tomorrow. Financial institutions call this over-compliance. When sanctions get imposed, banks and companies don't just follow the rules, they go far beyond them. They cut off entire countries, even when specific transactions would be legal. They refuse to process humanitarian shipments because the risk isn't worth it. They adopt zero-risk policies that hurt civilians in sanctioned countries, while protecting themselves from any possibility of violating restrictions. This is how medicines stop reaching Iranian cancer patients, even though medicine is exempt from sanctions. This is how food aid gets blocked, even though food is supposedly allowed. The sanctions create such a complex web of restrictions, secondary sanctions, and compliance requirements that companies and banks simply refuse to deal with sanctioned countries at all. Better to err on the side of over-compliance than risk being the next target. And the United States, because the dollar serves as the world's reserve currency, because most international transactions settle in dollars, because U.S. courts claim jurisdiction over any transaction that touches the U.S. financial system, has enormous leverage to enforce this. Even transactions between two non-American entities using non-American banks can fall under U.S. sanctions if they're denominated in dollars or route through U.S. correspondent banks. This is unprecedented power. Never before in history has one country been able to exert this level of economic control over the entire world, and they're using it aggressively. Secondary sanctions that punish third parties for trading with sanctioned countries. Threats to cut off allies from dollar markets if they don't comply with American policy. Freezing reserves held by foreign central banks, using access to the global financial system as a tool of coercion. For now, it works. The U.S. economy is still the largest in the world. The dollar still dominates international trade. SWIFT is still the standard. But trends are shifting. Dollar dominance is slowly eroding. Alternative payment systems are growing. Countries are finding ways around the restrictions, and each new use of sanctions accelerates the shift away from dollar-based systems. Goldman Sachs warned that overuse of dollar sanctions could compel other countries to replace dollar transactions. JP Morgan advised against kicking Russia off SWIFT, arguing it could have far-reaching fallout that would hurt the global economy. Both were ignored. The political appeal of sanctions was too strong. The appearance of action, too valuable. The lack of immediate blowback, too reassuring. But the long-term consequences are mounting. The more you weaponize the global financial system, the more incentive other countries have to build alternatives. And once those alternatives exist, once countries can trade, invest, and settle transactions without rooting through dollar-based systems, American leverage disappears. We're watching the slow-motion fragmentation of the global financial order. Not into chaos, but into competing blocks. A dollar zone controlled by the United States and its close allies. A yuan zone centered on China. Alternative systems for countries that want to avoid dependence on either. Multiple payment rails, multiple reserve currencies, multiple power centers. This raises a question nobody in Washington wants to answer. What happens when the dollar is no longer the only option? When countries can choose to trade in yuan, or euros, or local currencies, and still access global markets? When SWIFT is just one of several payment systems, when being cut off from American financial infrastructure no longer means economic death? The answer is that sanctions stop working. Or more precisely, they stop being the costless weapon they are today. If Russia can trade with China, India, and the Middle East without touching dollars or SWIFT, what leverage do Western sanctions really have? If Iran can sell oil to Asian countries and settle payments in yuan, what has been accomplished except making those countries economically closer to China? This is the trap. Sanctions work only as long as the global financial system remains centralized and dollar-dependent. But every use of sanctions as a weapon gives countries more reason to decentralize and de-dollarize. The more you use the weapon, the less effective it becomes, and you can't go back. Once trust is broken, once countries realize the financial system can be weaponized against them, they never fully trust it again. We're approaching an inflection point. Either the United States pulls back from using sanctions as its primary foreign policy tool, accepting that some challenges require actual diplomacy or actual military commitment, or it continues weaponizing the dollar until enough countries have built alternatives that American leverage evaporates entirely. The uncomfortable truth is that neither option is painless. Pulling back looks weak and invites challenges from adversaries. But pushing forward accelerates the decline of dollar dominance and fragments the global system America spent 70 years building. And throughout all of this, throughout the geopolitical chess game and the financial maneuvering and the competition for economic dominance, one group keeps paying the price. The civilians caught in the middle. Iranians who can't get medicine, Venezuelans watching their currency become worthless, Syrians unable to access banking services, Russians whose savings evaporated overnight, Afghans starving because aid organizations can't process transactions, Yemenis suffering because humanitarian organizations can't operate. These are the people who never voted for the policies their governments adopted, never had the power to change them, never benefited from them, but who bear the full cost of economic warfare waged from thousands of miles away by governments they'll never meet, pursuing goals they barely understand. Sanctions were supposed to be the humane alternative to war, a way to pressure governments without killing civilians, a surgical tool that would spare the innocent while punishing the guilty. That promise was always a lie. Economic warfare is still warfare. The weapons may be different, but the suffering is real. The devastation is real. The death toll, measured in medicines that never arrive and food that becomes unaffordable, is real. But unlike military warfare, economic warfare lets us pretend the damage isn't happening. It lets us believe we're not responsible. After all, we're not dropping bombs. We're just cutting off bank transactions. We're not invading. We're just freezing assets. We're not killing anyone. The humanitarian consequences are just unintended side effects, collateral damage in pursuit of noble goals, except they're not unintended. They're entirely predictable. They happen every single time. And they continue happening because the people making the decisions never face the consequences. This is the sanctions economy, a world where money has replaced armies as the primary weapon of state power, where economic isolation can devastate entire nations without firing a shot, where the global financial system itself has become a battlefield, and where the costs are invisible to the people imposing them, but catastrophic to the people paying them. The model is unsustainable. Every use of sanctions accelerates de-dollarization. Every frozen asset makes countries question the safety of dollar reserves. Every swift exclusion pushes nations toward alternative systems. We're building a world of financial blocks and competing currencies. A world where the United States has less leverage, not more. Where the dollar is one option among many, not the only game in town. When that world arrives, when the weaponization of finance has created enough alternatives that sanctions stop working entirely, what then? Do we return to military confrontation? Do we rediscover the lost art of diplomacy? Or do we face a world where great powers simply ignore each other's demands because economic pressure no longer matters? That's the unanswered question, the one hanging over everything we've discussed today. Sanctions work only as long as everyone has to use the same financial system, only as long as there's no alternative to dollars and SWIFT and Western financial infrastructure. But we're rapidly creating those alternatives. And when they exist, when de-dollarization is complete and countries can trade freely outside the dollar system, the sanctions weapon breaks. Some might see that as a good thing, an end to economic warfare that punishes civilians while failing to change government policy. But it also means an end to the illusion that we can pressure adversaries without actual commitment, without risk, without sacrifice. It means confronting the reality that foreign policy requires hard choices, not just easy gestures. In the next investigation, we're going deeper into how central banks became weapons, how inflation is exported and imported like a contagion, how monetary policy in Washington determines whether families in emerging markets can afford food. We're examining the machinery behind the money, the invisible architecture that turned currency itself into an instrument of power. The story of how economic warfare evolved from sanctions to something far more sophisticated, far more dangerous, and far harder to escape. This is conflict capital, where money and power meet, where the real wars are being fought, and where the battlefield is everywhere, including the wallet in your pocket. If you want to understand how the financial system really works, how economic power shapes the world you live in, and how these invisible battles determine your future, subscribe. Because the story we're telling is about more than history. It's about right now. It's about the economic forces reshaping global power. And it's about understanding the world, not as we're told it works, but as it actually functions. The sanctions economy is just the beginning. Thanks for watching.